Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm Susan Murray, for those of you that don't know me, and we're from the David Hume Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of our new programme of work with Professor Duncan Maclennan to look at the actions needed to transform the housing system in Scotland. Housing is one of the biggest issues facing Scotland. I'm delighted so many people have been able to join us for the launch of this work. A warm welcome to everyone in the room and also to those of you joining online. Before the discussion gets underway and to keep you all safe, I'd just like to confirm there are no fire alarms planned this morning, and if the fire alarm does go off, please head to the nearest exit. We are live streaming this event, and that is why the speakers have microphones. They do not work for amplification in the room, so if anyone is hard of hearing, we do have a couple of seats down the front, so please do move further forward. And just in case there is anyone in the room that doesn't know or online about the David Hume Institute, we are a think tank and we were established in 1985 to increase diversity of thought on the economy and all the issues related to it. And that's why we're here today. Housing is essential infrastructure for people and the economy to thrive. As an independent organisation, we have no vested interest in the housing sector, and we're delighted to be working with Duncan and our lead trustee, Ken Ross, to move actions forward. Unfortunately, Ken can't be with us today here in person due to a funeral, but he is with us in spirit. And now to formal introductions, just in case any of you don't know, or I'm being directed this way by the camera. Professor Duncan Maclennan, who I'm sure many of you know, needs little introduction. But for those of you who might be newer to the issue, Duncan has a long and internationally distinguished career as an applied economist, specialising in housing, neighbourhoods and cities. His professional roles have expanded senior positions in both academic and government settings in the UK, Canada and Australia. At the University of Glasgow in the 1980s, he established and led the Centre for Housing and Urban Research. And in the 1990s, he directed the ESRC Cities and Competitiveness Programme and the Joseph Rowntree programmes on housing, finance, housing and the macroeconomy, and housing and area regeneration. And following Duncan, we will have 3 reflections. I'll do the introductions now so that I'm done, and then it's over to everyone else. Callan Homchok, is that right, Callan? Is a national director who has led the team at the Chartered Institute of Housing since 2018. He previously worked in consultancy as head of public affairs at Pagoda PR and has worked in policy roles in the third sector and as a parliamentary researcher. Fiona Curl is director of public policy at Homes for Scotland. Fiona joined Homes for Scotland in April 2019, just before the pandemic, and is director of policy, where she has responsibility for strategic policy areas including housing to 2040, the Infrastructure Commission, Help to Buy, small-scale builders, and skills and the low-carbon agenda. Fiona is a qualified town planner with a master's in economic development and has experience in a range of planning, property and economic development issues, and she's worked in both the public and private sectors, primarily in urban regeneration and town centre renewal. And last but not least, we have our second Callum of the day, Callum Murray. Callum is also a town planner by qualification. He is development director with CCG Scotland and managing director of CCG Homes. He has led all of these roles since 2001 and has contributed to the growth of CCG as one of Scotland's largest privately owned construction and manufacturing groups, delivering over 1,000 homes per year. The business is acknowledged as a pioneer in the use of off-site modern methods of construction, and Callum is director of both and former chair of the industry collaborative Off-Site Solutions Scotland. He is also a founding director of City Legacy, the consortium that led the delivery of Glasgow's Commonwealth Games Athlete Village, which famously built 700 homes in 700 days. Fittingly, as Glasgow announced the forthcoming 2026 Commonwealth Games, he will shortly lead the final phase of delivery of Scotland's most unique urban regeneration initiative. So I'm delighted we have so many brains, not only on the panel, but also in the room. So when we do come to questions and comments, I want to make sure that we do bring in all your expertise. So without further ado, over to Duncan.
Thanks, Susan. Got to get the correct specs. It's a sign of ageing. Actually, there was somebody in the audience who said to me, I've come just to see you. I've actually just to see whether you're still alive or not. I should point actually out that I'm not actually the longest standing researcher in this room. It's actually Glenn Bramley from Heriot Watt. Glenn and I have known each other a long time. We only ever once applied for the same job. I don't know if he knows that, but he got it and I didn't. So I can reveal that after a very long time, Glenn. I had a humble start to my career and, as you can see, quite a humble finish. I think that I did start working on housing issues on the 1st of August 1974, where I was commissioned by the University of Glasgow, where I'd been an undergraduate and a postgraduate, to do some work on the effects of the 1974 Rent Act, which extended rent controls to the furnished rented sector, student housing, short-term letting and the like, and to work out the implications for student housing demand. I read stuff in the newspapers this week that's more or less exactly the same conclusions as I wrote and published 50 years ago, none of which are referenced in any of these reports, by the way, for those of you that might be watching. So that history repeats itself. I'll try not to repeat history too often as we go through this, but in the early days of my career, shortly after doing the work in student housing, I was asked about 1976 to go along and talk about the housing crisis. Oddly enough, with a group of shop stewards. I was asked to go and speak to a group of shop stewards for unions and basically the shipbuilding industry in Govan. And there was these, in Glasgow terms, were people who were mostly bears. They were really intimidating. The most fearsome chair of a meeting that I ever spoke at was at the head of the table and said, "Okay, Mr. Maclennan, you're going to tell us how to solve the Husson problem." And I was fairly intimidated, but I spoke for about 15 minutes. I actually stuck to time, which is unusual. I really was intimidated. And then he went round the room and he said, "Brothers, well, what should we be doing here?" And there's about 7 or 8 people commented. And they all talked about the need for more housing, more affordable housing, and so on. So at the end of this, and I'm sorry if this is a slightly rude word, he said, "Okay," he said, "Mr. Maclennan, we've heard your account of the story, and all the brothers have agreed. What we need to do is build more fucking houses." And that has stuck with me over all these years, because when I meet housing ministers in Australia or Canada or even Scotland, I'm often tempted to forget the first part of that story and just give them the conclusion because it still seems highly relevant. But to the business of the day, I'm very grateful that David Hume have asked me to look at this, to be able to, in a sense, use the experience I had here in the past, but also that I still have in working on housing issues in Canada and Australia. Because in the context of housing policies and housing programs, I think we have a policy discussion that is not going to end the emergency. I think we have an understanding of housing that is not appropriate for the modern times, nor indeed for the construction of effective governance for housing. And I don't think housing is effectively governed in the Scottish context. I would also say that about Australia, and I'm not making a political point or a party political point. In other words, I think that we have to have an approach here where we're really asking disruptive questions about governance and government, about the building, construction, supply system, about the non-profit system. We have to ask much harder questions than we've been doing so far. What we're doing is focusing on really tough times and really tough resource times, but we have to find ways of addressing the housing problem and thinking about it that are, I hope my remarks, they may be provocative, and I hope they're not offensive, apart from the jokes, but I hope they take us towards something that's more about collaboration and creativity. So in starting this program of work today, we're going to go through a process of having a discussion. I'm not here in a sense to present solutions. I'll be really glad if we identify some solutions by the time we get to me. It's about outlining what we're going to think about, how we're going to think about it, and how we hope to have a conversation with many of you and the organisations you represent through the period between January and April, May next year. So that we're starting doing the background work, if you like, at this point, but we want to have a discussion and starting today to home in on these questions. Now, people say academics are really useful for identifying questions and useless telling you solutions. I'm not trying to fall into that stereotype today, and I will suggest the kinds of solutions you should be thinking about. And I know some of you won't like some of them. Many of you won't like all of them. But I do think this is about posing questions and getting your feedback. And I'll be very happy if you communicate with me here or afterwards about saying, you've not got this right, or have you thought about, or are you taking this into account? In other words, we want to open this up rather than close it down at this point. So very briefly, I want to talk about 5 things. The current emergencies and the continuing system failures, not only in the OECD, and I call it the ABC, Australia, Britain, Canada context, and obviously Scotland. I then want to talk about reframing the meanings of housing and housing policy. I want to, if you do that, you then need to think about how you reshape the governance of policy, and then actually talk about some of the more shifting context of policies and how we might collaborate for change. Essentially, the emergencies that are being declared, I'll resist the observation that many of the emergencies are being declared by people who've helped to create them. But I do think that, you may try and convince me otherwise, but I do think that, so I'll be honest about it. The terrible trinity, as we called it, in a group of work that was called Shaping Housing Futures. And it's been across almost all of the OECD countries in different ways and different extents. It's been worse in the Anglo-centric policy and housing settings. It's been about rising homelessness, which actually has fallen in parts of the last 20 years in periods of intensive policy. In the early 2000s in the UK, COVID is very interesting. If you look at homelessness and the worst housed in these situations, they all improved during COVID because government actually directed resources. So the notion that you can't solve these problems is misleading, and we should learn from the COVID experience that these very severe difficulties can not only be abated, but give better prospects to individuals. But homelessness is rising again. We know that rental sector pressures, whether in the social sector, where queues have been growing, often for diminishing stocks of social housing, whether it's public or non-profit. These queues have been growing and the emergencies increasing in a context, at least up until 2016-17, in most settings, real resources going into these systems was diminishing. So that with pressures also in home ownership and diminishing non-profit and social provision, naturally you saw increased pressures and growth of the private rented sector. We've grown a private rented sector in this country, and it's been true in the other countries, by accident rather than design, in the sense it's a failure of the mainstream programs that have created the private rented sector as this terrain of now acute difficulty that we're having to think about how we deal with it. So that whether it's in homelessness or rental pressures, and particularly rent burdens of the cost of living crisis in that sector. But we also know that home ownership rates for age-specific rates for households under the age of 35 have been diminishing in the UK pretty much since the late 1990s. Actually in Australia since the early 1990s, Canada a bit later. So that, and they've been diminishing so much But the overall home ownership rate was only buoyed up by the fact that people like me who were homeowners lived longer. In other words, it was increasing longevity of those that already were homeowners that kept the rate high, whilst for the younger generation, there has been 20 years of acute difficulty. So when we talk emergency here, yes, the position has reached emergency outcomes and settings, but it's been long in the making, and it's been about big policy settings. It's not just been about Scotland. It's not just about devolution or independence or anything else. This is a pervasive set of circumstances that arises from the way in which the main socioeconomic trends that we have in our societies interact with big policy settings. And quite often, I don't mean housing policy settings. Housing policy serves as an inadequate palliative to the outcomes from fiscal policies, monetary policies, and a whole range of other policies. Now, if you recognise that point, just think, how effectively do we govern that? What does housing policy mean? Because it means you have to think about it differently. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. When you actually look across these countries, and it applies as much here as it does in Canada, there are really two different critical core processes. One is, if you look at housing affordability, it's not just about housing prices, it's also about incomes and employment as well. If you look at the distribution of income and wealth, it has shifted against the lowest income 20% in all these countries over the last quarter century. People in the UK and the US, for instance, have had hardly any real increase in their incomes for about 15 years. These incomes have been flat. So that, in essence, if we were to revert to conventional notions of merit good needs, that's why housing policy has been justified in the scale it has been in the UK for such a long time, that people deserve adequate housing. We now also have governments of all type that also add an extra merit condition that people deserve to be homeowners by a particular age. So you might think about the way in which the notion of a merit good has changed in relation to housing. But in that particular context, with these income distributions shifting against these groups, you could have expected merit good needs to have increased. To ensure that didn't translate into a worsening problem, you then needed to increase the amount of affordable rented housing and the increase of social and non-market rented housing for the lowest income groups, and should have been doing that from about 1995 onwards in that change in income distribution setting. Most countries haven't done it. We haven't done it to any adequate extent. So let's be really clear that there's a moral failure in that sense, and I'm not judging the morality, I'm just saying that we made a commitment about merit goods, and this is what housing programs are for, and we have not resourced them. So the palliative has not kept pace with the problem, and we need to be brutally honest about that. There is also a second, and I think absolutely critical, because this affects the whole system. Often in housing policy, we end up talking about the housing problem, and we talk about the 10, 15% who are worst off, and that's really important to prioritise that. But we really have to focus on the whole system, because that also affects how the poorest impact. But in effect, we have a setting in which real house prices have increased ahead of real incomes with cyclical fluctuations in the UK for almost 30 years. In fact, for longer than that. And the same is true in Australia and in Canada. In other words, the real price of housing, when you standardise for quality and type and size, has increased. That's a system failure. So, and I don't just mean a market system failure, it's a system failure that has increased housing costs and so on for all. If we don't think of it as a system failure and address that issue of rising real house prices, we will never resolve this issue. Let's be really clear about that. If we don't somehow get to much more stable housing prices or house prices that don't increase ahead of incomes, we will not resolve this issue. And that's at the core of it. So these are the two big trends, in a sense, we have to address. There's all these distributional issues, there's the moral issues, and that's what housing policy debate is almost always about, whereas the big system effect of rising real house prices, okay, we're beginning to get the supply side of the discussion in much better focus than we've been, and I'll say a bit about that, because that focus is neither detailed enough nor broad enough to actually get to the notion. So that effectively we get into a setting where affordable housing outcomes, a range of housing outcomes deteriorate. I stood on a platform in Melbourne with the then Prime Minister of Finance Minister, Treasurer of Australia. It's surprising we stood on the same platform because he was a big guy as well, and it was quite a small platform, where he said, we can no longer do the housing business as usual, and then proceeded for the next 3 years to do the housing business precisely as usual, which was underinvest in non-profits and throw in some home ownership initiatives that simply raised prices rather than outcomes. I've been in settings in Canada where people have really recognized the same thing, and roughly a year ago, Justin Trudeau stood on a platform in Hamilton, Ontario. Most Hamiltons are quite alike, by the way, and I know Hamilton's much nicer. And Jocelyn Fleming comes from Hamilton, Hamilton, Ontario, so I have to be really careful because Jocelyn's quite a force, I can tell you. And said, well, this is terrible, these are awful outcomes, but we, the federal government, have no courage, we have no policy courage. Fortunately, he's an extraordinarily good housing minister who's dug him out of that hole and actually begun to have a really effective framing of housing policy, which I think is somewhat better than in the UK, and I'll mention that as we go along. He is a housing minister who's actually originally of Scottish origin, I have to say. So we're quite proud of him, I think. But equally here, we now hear people talking about the system as broken. But very often when we hear discussions about, if you read all this stuff from some of the great contributions that were yesterday in housing, National Housing Day, everyone's blame shifting. It's always not me, Gov. There's a real crisis out there, but it's not me. It's not me, it's not us, it's not our government, it's not our level, it's somebody else, it's developers. No, it's landlords. It's all of them. And we have to think about it's a system, and we have to focus on that. Well, I think that's my time up. No, sorry, I'll try and push on a bit on this. Let me be slightly academic for a moment. It rarely happens in my career, but let me be slightly academic for a moment and get you to think about what housing is. I think if you adopt a systems view of housing, rather than saying we want to talk about the silo of social security or the silo of the treasury or the silo of the housing ministry, think about the system as a whole. That's the governance system. If you think about systems, you think about the connections between things. Whereas if you take, in other words, how does one thing relate to another? How does one policy impact another? How does the decision about interest rates affect housing outcomes? These are systems thinking. And we need to think about all sorts of characteristics of systems. Are they self-regulating? Do they induce evolution? Of course, people who believe in well-functioning markets say they're self-regulating systems, leave them alone, don't interfere with them. I believe in market-driven housing systems, and I think that view about a well-functioning housing market is entirely wrong. We have to have a coherent housing market strategy, which we've never had, and a whole set of instruments that correct the market failures that are around about it in capital markets, land markets, and labour markets. We'll come to that later. But within that context, very often when we discuss policy, and I've worked in governments, you discuss housing as a lump. And if you're doing social policy, you talk about total needs. If you're doing it in economic policy, and that's often not, doesn't often talk about housing, you talk about a number of housing starts or the share of residential investment. Now, these are big outcomes, and they're important in terms of the macro top-down system. But let's disaggregate what housing is. Housing is two things. It's a verb. It's about, or adverb, it's about designing it, financing it, planning it, building it, maintaining it, selling it. These are all activities which, in certain circumstances, can contribute 5 to 15% of GDP. So it's a big sector in terms of the annual turnover of an economy. We're still, and people recognize this in economic policy, and they talk about the multiplier effects and jobs and everything, and even cities talk about that, and that's about all they get in terms of how housing affects their economies. But it's also a noun. In other words, if you have a home, you're talking about shelter, you're talking about the size of the house, the design of the house, its energy efficiency, its location in a neighbourhood, its location relative to the activity sites that the household uses every day. That set of relationships of the housing attributes you have drive not only the social outcomes for that household, not only the environmental outcomes for that household, and we're more concerned about net zero, but also the economic outcomes in terms of access to work, productivity, time, space to learn at home, the development of human capital, use of assets for small business capital. There's a whole set of relationships that we never grasp. So we have to think, how does this system operate? But when you get to it, the housing system is not a residual, small social policy issue. Not even is it just a great big, important social policy issue, what it is, but it is a critical system, and housing outcomes are critical in the way in which we will reach net zero or not. They will be important in the way in which productivity is driven and human capital is developed, particularly for the bottom half of the income distribution over the next 30 years in Scotland. And none of that is in the policy discussion about productivity. None of it. And I think that, so when we look at what housing is and what housing does, open your minds up to what the range of outcomes are that we need to really have on the table. Now, if you're going to have all these things on the table, you can't leave them to the housing ministries and departments that currently run housing systems. That's why I come back to changing governance again. But we also need to recognize that housing, it's also an asset, but also, and this is very nerdy, it's spatially fixed capital. You ground housing, you put it in the ground, and therefore people have a view that housing is primarily local and it's social. But what drives that local outcome reflects not only local, regional, national, but global forces. So that it's a housing system, it ends in a grounded product, but it's an open system in terms of what drives it. And it's an open system. In other words, if we're going to talk about housing success in Scotland, we can't just think about Scotland. We've got to think about what are the influences from the UK economy, from other economies, from interest rate changes that are globally driven. We've got to have that in our framing. But we also have to recognize that the outcomes that there are, if your house produces too much carbon in its heating system, the effects are global. We don't need to argue about that anymore. If it's not enhancing the human capital capabilities of your child because it's inadequate space or you keep moving every year, that's going to matter for productivity and growth in Scotland as well. So that we need to have these relationships at the core of what we think. So this notion of housing as a system, as having complex outcomes, does not pervade the way we govern policy. And I think that we marginalize the significance of housing in the way we think about the way we govern and so on. Now, what would I do about this? And these are just serving suggestions. They'll be too revolutionary for some people in here and not revolutionary enough for others. I'm just suggesting that in this project we have to think round about some of these things. If we now recognise that housing is a big system, and it's also, the emergency is a reflection of this, it's become a wicked system. Now, wicked systems don't get well managed by sectoral silos, i.e. we don't solve the housing problem just by looking at the housing department or the housing ministry, but they also involve multiple orders of government. The autonomies and powers to deal with housing issues are spread across different levels of government. In the UK, this is relatively recent, the tensions there are between, well, no, not recent, but just different in form, the tensions between Westminster and Holyrood, and between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and you know, all these tensions, different intentions, all these orders of government have obligations, but they also have different policy autonomies. And in that context, if you're going to run a system that creates complex outcomes and is driven by complex factors, and you're worried about that system, you've got to think about a governance that's about a network of ideas. You've got to think about governance that involves all orders. In other words, we will not solve our housing problems in Edinburgh unless Edinburgh communities are engaged in this, Edinburgh's engaged in this, the Scottish Government's engaged in this, the UK Government's engaged in it. You can't actually, we're not an independent country, and as long as monetary and fiscal policy are largely determined somewhere else, you can't talk about housing policy in Scotland and resolve it without actually being really clear on that as a background. And that was missing in the 2040 paper. It was missing in the independence paper. And it's still missing in the discussion and in the governance structure. So what about the governance structures then? If you have this entity that's driven by different things, producing different outcomes, then very clearly the policies of a government that affect housing systems and outcomes are not simply those of the housing ministry. So housing policy is more than the housing ministry. Fiscal policy is critical, environmental policy is critical, infrastructure policy is critical, monetary policy, financial regulation, all of these things are critical, and I'll give you one or two examples in a moment. But in essence, in any level of government, you have to have a strong integrating device. Have a cabinet secretary who has real responsibility for the housing system, not the municipal housing budget or the budgets of the housing ministry, the housing system. Scotland needs housing system governance, and we don't have that. And in that context, you could have a cabinet secretary who is responsible for housing. I would also put housing in infrastructure, and I can explain to you why I would do that. But also you'd need to, in the context we're in, have housing, infrastructure, land, planning, and probably transport effectively in the same ministry. In terms of the places we're trying to create, the lives of people that we're trying to create, we don't really have an effective housing ministry in Scotland. Sorry, not housing ministry. Housing minister is perfectly okay. We don't have an infrastructure ministry. We have the SFT that looks at a selection of infrastructure issues. We have a transport division. These need to be brought together really quickly. And on top of that, every ministry has to, as long as we have a housing emergency, have a housing impact statement of what their policies are about to do. And that includes the economics ministries. They really need to up their game on this in our context. So that's the first thing. We also need to make, I think, a step change in delivery. When I look at where Scotland is now, there's lots of breathy ideas about the future and how we reach 2040. And there's lots of strategy documents. I said this in relation to another subject recently, but it's true also in housing. I open the document and I think, whoa, I'm going to sign up for this country. This is going to be great. It's all about embracing the aspiration to do these things properly. I get to chapter 2, it's about the evidence. That's a bit patchy because the Scottish Government has spent more or less no serious money on housing research in the last 15 years. So that a lot of the things are done by the industry and academics who get money from basically England to do work in Scotland, but it hasn't resourced understanding the Scottish housing system adequately. And in that context, we really need to make a significant step change. And I think that there is a strong case for looking at whether we need a national agency that will be delivering the integrated policy that ministries have to develop the policy. I think we need a national agency that actually deals not just with housing in the way that Scottish Homes did, or in a way similar, but also brings together the other place-related functions. The Scottish Futures Trust, we've got the SFT, we're setting up a planning hub. Why aren't we setting up a housing hub? Why don't we just create an agency that brings all these things together and actually concentrates on their effective delivery? We do not have that delivery of governance change from Holyrood to neighbourhoods and places that we had 20 years ago. And I think it really shows in the way in which the system does not move forward. I don't think it should operate in the same way as Scottish Homes, by the way. I was on the board of Scottish Homes longer than anyone else, so I have more experience to perhaps explain why that might be the case. We'd have to have a different character and have a different way of being accountable. I also think that these issues, in terms of governance in Scotland, about infrastructure and housing investment and strategy, should lie at the regional partnership level. I think that's the scale at which they will connect to economic development. I think they will also connect, as long as these regional partnerships are also the focus for strategic plans that we've basically given, and strategic spatial planning, that we've abandoned in Scotland over the last 30 years. In the 1990s, the Scottish local governments, it was true in Midlothian and Edinburgh, it was true in Strathclyde. Strathclyde region was regarded as one of the best planning entities in Europe. I usually disagreed, you'd be surprised to learn, with their conclusions. I don't think they took enough account of the market, but at least they had a coherent plan for where the region was developing, where infrastructure might go, and indeed where housing might go. We don't have that anymore. These plans do not exist in any coherent form. So I think that they also have to be articulated at that regional metropolitan scale, but also rural regional scale within Scotland. Bring these things together. If you look at what's done in Australia and in some parts of Canada, not all parts, you would find that that makes sense in terms of delivering much more effective outcomes. I do think that in how you set up these regional entities, it's also really important. I think that in the housing side, I think we should have, Australia has a National Housing Supply Council where not politicians, but industry members and experts on the supply side actually sit down and talk about what's unfolding, what's happening in supply, what needs to happen. I think given the supply emergency, I think we should have regional housing supply councils in Scotland. And I think they should be attached to the regional economic partnerships. Let's be serious about this, because it's not just about, and I'll come back to this, relaxing planning regulations. It's about land, what you pay for it, how much is available, should it be compulsorily purchased? That's coming back on the agenda big time in England, and it may be that we have to go there. If we're doing that, who's responsible for servicing that land that will come so that it's got the infrastructure? In other words, if developers get land, they know it's connected, they know that they can develop it. We need to think these things through, and I think a regional housing supply council, which would involve for-profit and non-profit sectors in that, as really significant players, would give us the information and insight and actual delivery experience that is lacking within government. Government doesn't do these things very well. In terms of the whole approach, I do think that given the multi-sector, multi-order, I think the individual investment programs and small grants here and there, are a thing of the past. There have to be strategic housing infrastructure and other program integrated investment partnerships that applied at these spatial levels. This may sound a bit like city deals or growth deals or whatever. In a sense it is. It's about bringing together private and public money and all the public money and public land and doing them in a deal framework, and we will get much more out of it in terms of coherence, but also we'll get leverage in terms of the limited government finance that there might be. But in doing that, the people who have to lead it are local leaders. It's not for Scottish level government to lead these things, nor indeed a Quango. It's about a local political system that has to lead them and be influenced by them. Anyway, these are, as I said earlier, just serving suggestions. You can tell I've thought about the menu a little bit, but I do think we have to debate about how do we govern Scotland's housing. I personally think it's worse than it was 30 years ago, and it's costly, and it holds us back and doesn't either leverage the right amount of private resources nor use them effectively. In terms of, and Susan, sorry to speak so long, I'll finish really quickly. Just 3 or 4 points I think that are really important. In terms of the way the discussion has gone, Rachel Reeves did it in her first speech. It was, the problem in housing is supply, supply, supply. You can get the same refrain in government in Canada, although the housing minister doesn't actually believe it, and you'll get the same refrain in Australia. It's doing the supply side much more effectively and thinking about what the development industry needs and requires is really important, and faster permissions or whatever can be really significant in some places rather than others. But in effect, there's 2 things on this. The first is, if you look at the surge in the emergency, so-called post about 2015, I think that reflects 3 things. It reflects a slow growth in incomes, so people have to rent rather than buy. It reflects the growth in international student numbers, particularly in the UK, Australia and Canada. In Australia, they went from 150,000 to 850,000 in something like 10 years, and Canada's quite similar. These 2 countries also, post-COVID, really boosted their immigration rates to make up for what had been there before. So demand systems can change quickly. Construction, in its nature, doesn't change quickly. It's a complex, lengthy process. Callum's cutting down that length, and that's important, but I think that it's still a lengthy process. And in that context, governments haven't paid anywhere near enough attention to the demand side of the system. The crisis, in particular, of the last 4 or 5 years has been about shortages in rental markets. And that failure to integrate policies that affect the housing sector at national levels, whether from higher education or, of course, stress testing, which might, by the Bank of England here, might be now much more too severe for the conditions we're now in, and therefore rationing people out of home ownership and pushing them into renting. We've got to challenge all these things, because that all boosted rental sector demand, and that's where the drivers of pressure have been over the last 5 years in particular. So that, yes, supply, but be cautious and careful about demand. Where's the Scottish Government on these demand side issues? And in that context, I've mentioned already that on the supply side of the system, I think faster permissions are important. I think that at the UK level, I think that the Chancellor's got it wrong in saying, if we do all this and speeding up permissions, it will mean this increased housing output. I don't think it will. There's not the skills set available to build the houses. The infrastructure is not there to make the connections, and interest rates on development finance are really high. So, and actually, supply is actually going downwards rather than upwards at the moment, so that you might end up just with a larger stock of undeveloped permissions. And I think that's a real danger. But it's attractive for politicians to say that. because at a national level, it doesn't cost them any money. It doesn't cost them any money to say, this is your fault, municipal planning departments. And central banks do exactly the same. I find it almost laughable when I hear governors of central banks talking about how the supply side of the housing system is down to municipal permissions. And that comes out of a set of economics that is not credible in terms of real systems. And happy to discuss that with anyone that disagrees with it. So that I think supply side audits, the kind of supply policy infrastructure we're talking about supply, and really getting it boosted is important. But we will not solve the housing shortage just simply by dealing with supply. The totals of housing that would have to be built will actually significantly distort the economy. And government won't actually reach its targets. It's setting itself up to fail, in my view, at this present time. So boosting supply, yes, but being much more careful about how far and how we do that. Finally, I think that, or two finals that would be highly contentious. I think that rental sector policy, private rented sector policy in Scotland is a mess. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. I think that there is a case in the context of slow growth of incomes and fast increases in rents for having a well-constructed system of rent controls. The problem is getting governments to make that well-constructed system, and it certainly hasn't done it in the Scottish context. And we see some of the outcomes of that in terms of reduced investment and actually building more near market rent and market rent housing for the middle of the system is actually really important in terms of the specifics of the crisis that we have. And whether you do that through attracting pension and equity finance into the non-profit sector, which could be done, I think, at a much greater scale, or whether you actually think about how you design policy. The problem in rented housing is we define it by tenure, but it's actually about 6 very different demand groups to people, high income people like me, who move around quite a lot. You don't have a problem paying the rent, to people increasingly who have been rationed out of social housing and are desperately poor. Design a policy system, if you will, in a single set of policy measures. You can't do it and make any sense of it. So government has to go back to the start and think, what are the functional systems here rather than just the notion of legal tenure and how we organise it. And finally, I do think that in the home ownership sector, I think it's really important that we have a growing home ownership sector, largely because the majority of Scots still aspire to be homeowners at some time. Now, I'm not saying let's distort lots of subsidies and so on to achieve that, but I think that the home ownership sector for a long time in economies has actually spread wealth and encouraged steady savings and left people with assets in older age. It's not operated in that way over the last 10 to 15, even 20 years. It's become the main speculation system that average Brits, Scots, Australians and Canadians use. And in that context, there are all sorts of strategies about maximising capital gains rather than steady savings. There's a crazy, and I use that word advisedly, article by David Alexander in the Scotsman today saying, how dare the government think about taxing anyone's housing inheritance? I think I might even write, I rarely write letters to the press, I am tempted, although Susan might ban me. On the grounds that I do think that if we want to think about solving the housing crisis, keeping a lid on housing prices is important, and you can't do it just by building more and more homes. There are tax and other issues. The demand for housing is stimulated because it's this almost free increase in asset positions that you have. Unless we recognise, and particularly, and unfortunately, my generation begin to die quite soon, we're going to leave this pile of housing wealth to our children. The kids of poorer people and renters get nothing. When I was lecturing last at St Andrews, people said to me, what would you do about this? And I said, go home and kill your siblings. And make sure that if your parents get divorced, none of them marry anyone who rents a house. You could say that 10 years ago in the university. I don't know, I'm not sure if you could say it now. Anyway, that was the advice. The point is, if we want to have a system, if you look at how middle and upper income households in Austria, Switzerland and Germany invest their money, they invest it in small companies and in innovation. And if you look at their innovation system, it's not all just big firms or university science parks, it's all kind of firms. We don't do that. Why would I help anyone invest in a good idea when I can sit happily in Belgrave and see my house? It's not gone up that much in recent years, but it will, and it will again. Why would I put my money anywhere else? And when I'm not here, it doesn't really get taxed, or not taxed very much. That's a recipe for reduced social mobility in the longer term. And that's coming fast because the over 65s own roughly 65% of Britain's housing wealth. And they're going to be passing that in that very unequal, divisive pattern that precludes social mobility. And it will also discourage people from investing domestic surpluses in investments that create growth and productivity. I won't say any more about productivity, nor even anything else. And I've tried, Susan's been very nice. She hasn't even signaled shut up yet. But I am going to stop talking. But you'll see why I think we really need a disruptive view in this. You can't actually fix this system. And I know in capital gains, no political party will touch it. But when all these other measures, if they don't keep a lid on house prices, don't work, the cross-party consensus to do something about it, not least because if you don't do anything about it, you suddenly begin to see more people are in rented housing. Rental majorities are beginning to re-emerge in our big cities. The constituencies that the Liberal Party in Australia lost in the last election were significantly those in which rental housing was important, but they'd previously held. So that if politics doesn't do something about housing, housing outcomes eventually do something about politics. So, thank you.
We're now just going to have a few reflections and I'll see you'll start us off.
Thanks everyone, thanks for inviting me along to speak. So I've got 2 minutes. I suppose the first thing I'd say, I'm really excited by what Duncan set out in the discussion and actually how we look at the housing system. But I think before we even get into any of the specifications and some of the policy ideas you've kicked around there, Duncan, and I'm not going to get into the detail, I think the only way this is going to work is if we engage widely. So it's not just in this room. It's, we talk about the kind of failure it's in government over the long term. It's not just the existing government and the officials. It's parliamentarians. It's the only way some of the ambition that we saw on that slide actually can be realised is by really engaging in kind of deep approach and actually making people think about the kind of the systems and interconnectedness. So I think that you've got an ambitious timetable. May is not long when we were talking about some of the scale of the change. But the only way, if we're going to start this discussion about actually how to reimagine the housing system, is actually working with everybody who's got a part in it. I think the other bit for me is probably particularly exciting is actually just that discussion around housing system and the interconnectedness. Duncan was, I wouldn't say dismissive, but he was talked about maybe some of the things that are missing in Housing to 2040. I think for the most part, Housing to 2040 was an excellent vision document, but I don't think we've in any way followed through on the kind of detail and the kind of promise. And we can argue we've still got another 16 years to actually get there, but we need to start the groundwork. And actually, I think that we are we need to focus on the outcomes we want to achieve. And I thought Housing at 2040 was really positive about that, but actually we need to understand the detail and actually the interconnectedness of the housing system. We don't do that. I think everybody, Duncan talks about the failures in the rented market there. Most people in this room will have representations around the housing bill, particularly around the kind of rent controls and the PRS, and are concerned about that failure to recognise it's part of a wider housing system. You can't just look to address affordability in the private renting sector without recognising the kind of knock-on effects that have elsewhere, and that's what a system looks like. We need to recognise we're all interconnected, so our focus on homelessness or supply or affordability is all legitimate, it's all correct, but it has a knock-on effect, and a wider system thinking needs us all to consider that. So we need to, as organisations, representative bodies, need to get out our own silo thinking and only think about our own members, our own interest groups, and think about that interconnected system. So I think Duncan's work, if it helps us move in that direction, will be really, really welcome. Yeah, Duncan, he talked about the kind of failures in the long term, leadership. Yeah, absolutely. But we also need to look at ourselves. It's not just political leaders, not just local leaders. Actually, how are we challenging ourselves? How are we thinking differently? How do we just get into the same cycles and running the same campaigns, doing the same things and complaining to Westminster or Holyrood? So there's that challenge of leadership, the challenge of structure. I think structure is really interesting. I've only been in the housing sector 6 years. I've heard so much about Scottish homes. I've literally no idea what it is. But there's a bit around the structure. How do we go back to maybe some of the structures that might have worked more effectively? So let's explore that. It might not, but it might. Collaboration, oh my God, yes. During COVID was probably the most collaborative I've ever seen this sector, where there was a lack of egos and a lack of self-interest. And that includes CIH and myself in that. I'm absolute part of that. But we drifted away from that. Actually, so how do we find that? And I'm not saying any of this is easy. It's a really challenging prospectus Duncan's put up there about how we deliver it. But it is that focus on outcomes rather than the inputs, and I think that's probably the risk that we've had over the short term. I suppose that I just finished by saying I think we've all got our preferences around what the housing system should look like. We all have preferences around the kind of inputs, and we want to see. We need to challenge ourselves and be open to that. When Duncan spoke at our conference in March this year, he talked about financialisation of the market, and the minister I know was quite open to that. And a lot of alarm bells for me at CIH. I think there's a lot of alarm bells for our members, but we also need to be focused more on the outputs and actually the difference it makes in people's lives, rather than any preconceived notions of what we think is the best thing to do. So I'll stop there, Susan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So I represent the home builders in Scotland, Homes for Scotland. We have about 200 members who build about 90% of the homes of Scotland, and that's across all tenures. So I think that gives a really interesting perspective, actually, and it was our own annual conference yesterday. So very clear as to some of the discussions that we had from the politicians yesterday, which was that there was a very clear and surprising cross-party alignment on a lot of the views yesterday. That was the first time, I think, in a while that we'd had that kind of consensus. I just wanted really to start in terms of what Duncan was saying. I had to laugh at your story about the trade unions and their colourful language as to what we needed to do. I posted on Friday afternoon on LinkedIn a picture of the mug that sits on my desk, and as we were doing the final preparations for the conference, I just posted this mug which just says, "Build more bloody houses." And it had the single most interactions that I've had on my LinkedIn and Twitter feeds in the last 6 months. So that maybe gives quite a good indication that it might have been 50 years ago that trade unions were saying it, but they're still saying it to us now. We are hearing increasingly from, and we are engaging with industry across Scotland. One of my colleagues this morning is at a meeting with the Greenport and the Moray Greenport developers to understand the connections between what we want from Scotland as a growing economy and the role that housing has to play in supporting those economic ambitions. So I think we're seeing that realisation. Your points about a systemic, a cabinet secretary responsible for the system, that really sits very strongly supportive of that. Over the last 12 months or so, we have become so frustrated with government that every single time we write a letter to anyone in government, whether it's economy division or it's about climate change or wherever it is, the response comes back from the More Homes team. And we're saying, but we're not trying to talk to you about homes. We're trying to talk to you about the economy or the climate or whatever that is. And it's been so frustrating. So that call for a CABSEC responsible for that systemic thinking, I think, is something we would really welcome. Encouragingly, yesterday, the Deputy First Minister at our conference made much more of, certainly in terms of language, much more strongly positioning housing as fundamental to the future of Scotland, both in terms of economy and society. And that was the first time that we'd really heard that really strong repositioning, certainly in the last few months. And interestingly, our Chief Executive just yesterday was appointed to sit on the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. Now that board is chaired by Kate Forbes. And again, so that's at the heart of Scotland's economy. And it was interesting then that said that housing is now being placed alongside that. One of the things I also wanted to touch on was about regulation. One of the points that I was making yesterday was one of our small-scale home builders provided me information in the last couple of days about a tally that they have done in terms of what they think the cost of additional regulation is on homes in Scotland. So this is nothing to do with Brexit or Ukraine or inflation or anything like that. This is simply the cost of recent and upcoming regulation. And they estimated that it was costing in the region of £35,000 per home. That's an additional cost. Now that cost has to be met by somebody. So whether that's a homeowner, whether that's government, whether that's an RSL, somebody has to meet that additional cost of regulation. So I know you made reference, I think, earlier there about the cost of deregulation. We're not talking about throwing all regulation out, but we need to look systemically at it. And it's important that we do that because some of the recent research that we carried out about 18 months ago in terms of the social and economic impact of housing in Scotland, we estimated that the contribution to the Scottish economy is about 3.5 billion per annum, about 80,000 jobs supported, and about roughly 4 jobs for every new home that's built. And we estimate that there's a shortfall of around about 110,000 homes in Scotland already accumulated. So I think all of these things, Duncan, that you've talked about is really helpful. And I'm surprised that with just how much of it I think the home builders and the development system will be able to get behind. When I first heard you starting to speak, I thought, oh God, right, what's he going to put up here? But I think everything that you've put up is a very reasonable systemic approach, and I can see why the development industry will be broadly in alignment with that, which is quite surprising.
Fiona, nobody's ever described me as very reasonable before.
Your mic.
I think the microphone's working, yeah? Yeah. It's a privilege actually to be sitting here with Duncan. I've known him for over 30 years, since I was a student. And I've seen him in many guises as a lecturer and authority in housing. He's an intellectual heavyweight. He makes me feel like an intellectual minnow. Every time I sit with him, I listen to that, and I'm absolutely impressed. Our industry needs to understand how the system needs to change, how we move it forward, and having this man at the table driving an appraisal over the next few months, whether the period to May is a short-term, insufficient period of time will tell. But we absolutely need to bore into this. I was profoundly disappointed yesterday in attending the Homes for Scotland conference that John Swinney never turned up. That was a short notice withdrawal, but we've got a housing emergency. At least Westminster and the Scottish Government are agreed on one thing: we have got a housing emergency. But it was a pity that wasn't adequately reflected right at the top, because yesterday's conference for our industry was absolutely important. For a government that's 17 years in power, the penny's taken a wee while to drop. We've had a pandemic. The pandemic proved, if proof were required, that home, health and well-being are intrinsically linked. And despite having a recently invoked cut of £200 million from the affordable housing budget, would you know there's an emergency? £200 million of a cut, that has been enormously damaging. And we talked, Fiona and I, yesterday about the body language. The synergy across the politicians was evident. Everyone acknowledges there's a housing emergency. There appears to be cross-party commitment. The Greens didn't turn up either, did they? There's cross-party commitment to driving this forward and to invoking change. But the fundamental issue is one that is going to be difficult for those parties to address and adequately resolve. The consequences, the immediate consequences, and the damage that's ensued from it is that we've got 5,000 homes overall that are stalled, and 1,800 of those homes are affordable. Now, the problem's exacerbated, and I know Duncan's has spoken slightly about this, but it's exacerbated by the statutory approval system that we've got. It's under-resourced and underproductive. One of the reasons I would give you an immediate fix, I'm into quick fixes because our board makes decisions quickly. We have to make decisions quickly. But one of the quick fixes that wouldn't cost anything, hybrid working practices in an under-resourced environment, in a systemic, or amidst a systemic difficulty, is one area that could be fixed at a stroke. We simply have to get our public sector back to work in the normal way. And I make no apologies for that. I've experienced too many examples. I'll give you a good example, actually. We are going through a planning application process, which is, up until this week, was 4 months overdue. We actually got the approval on Tuesday. It was Glasgow's only approval through the system. That was commented on yesterday. It was absolutely remarkable that a city authority the size of Glasgow has got one application going through for approval. A major affordable housing project in the east end of Glasgow that's been driven by us with Clyde Gateway. It should deliver 174 houses, but is there any money to deliver it? Will the funding be there? We don't know. But the planning process has been strung out by 4, 5, 6 months. Why? One of the reasons is the hybrid working practices. I got an email on a Saturday night at 5 to 7 from a planner who was providing us with some belated information. I immediately got a response from a planning consultant who said, "Does she not watch Strictly?" A Saturday night, that's what it's come down to. Now, that planning officer wasn't available in the regular course of the working week, certainly not easily available by telephone, by email, or by a remote means. That is the sort of major difficulty that we're experiencing on a very practical level. The impact is on productivity, and a serious impact as a consequence on jobs. The housing sector and construction is experiencing an extreme impact from redundancy and business failures. And there's a direct correlation with the withdrawal of the £200 million that the Scottish Government has elected to make. That was a positive choice. They had other choices, but that's their choice. Where is it evident? I'll tell you where it's evident. I work in development. At the front end of development, I've started to see jobs, redundancies through design teams. An architectural practice we work with, I learned this week, have shed 20 jobs. 20 jobs, and that's only in one practice. Within housing associations, we've got housing associations that have downed tools and have stalled planned investment in housing. Within the private sector, we've got suppliers and manufacturers who are beginning to aggressively cut costs. Again, that means cutting jobs. There's absolutely no denying that. The impact is going to be serious for the industry, because how do we recover? It's happening at the worst possible time. We're in a period where we need to plan for growth and plan for transition as we move forward with the sustainability agenda. And jobs and retraining and our human capital, as Duncan has referred to it, is absolutely essential. And at the minute, we have completely and utterly undermined it. Just when we need it, our skills base is becoming fractured. The situation is worsened by a raft of regulatory change that Fiona has referred to, and that threatens to make affordable housing unaffordable. The 35,000 additional cost that's coming through, if I told you our average affordable housing project is delivering at the minute a cost at around £250,000 a unit. We've got one project in Edinburgh where, for a variety of reasons, on an affordable level, the current cost is sitting north of 350. Now that's at a design stage. It's a passive standard of delivery that's been proposed. That's one of the reasons that it's sitting at that level of cost. There are many, but it gives you an indication as to where cost is headed. Our affordable housing is seriously in danger of becoming unaffordable, hence the reason we've got housing associations that are choking their output. So systemic change is essential for me in development. The funding tap cannot just be turned on and off. We need long-term strategic planning. We need long-term budgets. We need commitment, and we need visibility and funding delivery. In terms of the direction of travel, Duncan, as I say, you're a heavyweight in many ways. As an intellectual, is just the man to set the course and set the compass. And I look forward to genuinely working with you, I hope, to move this forward.
Just going to grab the microphone and then... Fantastic. I know we've got lots of expertise in the room. Oh, I can see Kim waving at me straight away. Great. I'll go to you first.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to just ask you, first of all, make an offer. I work for LGIU, Local Government Information Unit. We work in Australia, Ireland, Scotland, and England. And we have 50,000 plus readers in local government every morning. So I would like to make an offer to work with you. And I would like to quote probably somebody you know, Duncan, Professor Phil Hanlon. Public health view, it all matters. So I think what you strike here is the fact that it all matters. We have to make a whole system approach to sustainable development, public health, of which housing, of course, is critical. You know, in the recent weeks of seeing the Grenfell report, nobody can be under any illusion that this is critical and urgent. So my question is, who in the world is doing it well? Who can we look to for learning and good practice?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that there are cities, I think there are states, provinces, devolved administrations and national governments who do some things well. I can't think of any perfect authority. If I wanted to think about a system that has really effective strategic planning of infrastructure, now also some housing, and actually talks about how places will grow and change, I think the Australian cities do it infinitely better, Sydney and Melbourne in particular. That would be an example of that practice. I think in terms of the governance of the top level issues and bringing things together, the shift of housing policy in the last 18 months from Social Development Canada, which was, if you like, the traditional palliative programme, to infrastructure, has hugely changed the way the government thinks about housing, because infrastructure departments do think about outcomes. I know in Scotland not necessarily, but most other infrastructure departments think about outcomes, and they are concerned with economy, environment, society. These are the standard questions that an infrastructure department asks that housing ministries don't. So there are bits of practice. In terms of private finance for larger scale housing associations, I think England has done a really good job relative to Australia's catching up a bit. The Australian government have put some interesting mechanisms for changing the way non-profit housing is financed. So there's a whole patchwork of things, and I'll hopefully deploy some of them. There are also some really good examples of ways to do things. I'm talking about the countries I work in, but obviously some European experience. I think, for instance, in terms of commitment to social housing, the French government remained committed to providing, up to 15% of social housing in more or less every area, in a way that other governments didn't, despite what David Alexander wrote. And I'm sorry, that's 2 weeks in a row. I think he's been fundamentally wrong. He was saying there is nowhere in the world, because he'd read an Institute of Economic Affairs publication, and they're really quite right-wing as economists. He said, experience shows that nowhere in the world has this worked. There are lots of cities in North America that have rent control systems that are pretty satisfactory because they're reasonably well designed in the setting that they're in. So depending on what your policy choice is, I think you can look at good examples. But I also do think that in terms of international experience, the most effective thing it does is it helps you improve the questions you ask about your own system rather than the mechanisms that you grab somewhere else and bring here. So sorry about the long answer, but it was a fairly demanding question.
I'm Eddie Black from the Eco Group. I haven't got any vested interest in the construction sector or housing, but we have looked at it as a problem statement for us as a company. So we touch probably in every industry outside, with the exception of hospitality or probably retail. So we've looked at technology and other industry practices on how do you create volumetric, high accuracy, regulated, highly regulated processes to solve the housing crisis. Yeah. Even though the housing crisis is probably the most restrictive and the hardest part to enter with new technology. So I suppose my question is, you look at your phone in your pocket, you look at the cars on the road, they've all advanced massively. Housing and construction hasn't. It's probably, for 100 years, it's still much the same as it was. It's maybe done slightly differently, but there's no real fundamental change. And I've been fortunate enough to go to being invited to many other countries that have got the same problems, but not necessarily in the same priority list. So I was just in Lagos not long ago, and the poor there, they just want safe space. They just want something that functions. Social housing here's way above what they would look at as a solution. So my question is, how do you fit breaking the barriers of adoption of other technologies that have been proven in other industries for decades but not adopted by the housing sector?
I think that's a very good question, and I spent a lot of time talking about other things, and I should have talked about technological change, modular housing, modern methods of construction, because again, I think there's whole areas of our life, whether it's vehicles, aircraft or whatever, where engineering has done amazing things in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think that there's evidence that technological change, and companies like Callum's are beginning to use it, makes a real difference to not only the cost, to the training and retention of labour skills. It changes the nature of the housing construction industry in ways that I think haven't been thought about enough. And I think that I would have emphasised that. If you want, in Canada, the federal government has decided to take all federal land and use it essentially to provide affordable housing with competitive bidding to and I think non-profits will be the dominant part of that. I've been also encouraging them to make development of modular housing, new construction and so on, an important component of that, because whilst I think it's important that the non-profit sector has reasonable, decent standard housing, actually developing modular construction in that setting might be a very cost-effective way of doing it. And I know Callum's company have not only been doing that, but they've been involving disadvantaged kids from the east end of Glasgow and skilling them up in factories in a way that doesn't actually happen on sites in wintertime and summertime in the Scottish context. So I agree with that, and we do actually have to take that. On the supply side, by the way, I agree about the frustration of all these regulations. The point I was making about supply is there's an awful lot more than the regulations that need to be fixed in the system, and also the demand side looks at. But part of that is, so one of the strands of our work should be about refashioning the supply side of the system in Scotland. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, all of you, for these contributions. All of a sudden, I took an interest when the Institute of Economic Affairs were mentioned. Christian Niemitz writes extensively on this and has some very good radical thoughts. But the one thing that's perfectly clear from the recent study you mentioned is that rent control is a disaster. In fact, just talking about rent control means that people will sell up, and houses will not be available for mobile employees, and capital will not come into housing. I know you've got a few counter examples, but there were 200 examples the IEA looked at. And here in Edinburgh, and indeed in Scotland generally, the destruction of the tenements in the 1950s and 60s, largely caused by this socialistic policy of rent control. I'm not a landlord, so let's put that to one side. I'm a councillor. I'm involved with social housing. The number that got me was 350,000. That's what it costs now to build a passive house, social house in my part of the world, Midlothian, which is a very large stock of council houses. You do that for a 2-bed. Across the road, there's an existing 4-bed triplex apartment for £150,000. It is much better for us to refurbish that with double glazing and make it somewhat better in terms of environmental impact than to put up a 350,000 passive house which has a rent of only 4,000. Of that rent of 4,000, 45% goes on maintenance and administration. So one thing's fairly clear to me is that the discrepancy between social rents and market rents is a problem, and that the only conclusion is that the social rents will have to rise. They are absurdly low at the moment and do not create enough of a balance in order to fulfill our obligation to try and build more houses. I know that a lot of people in this room will be offended by what I say, but this is a practical concern for councillors of all shades. One of them came in to me yesterday and said, I can't understand why our rents are so low. I see people in the council schemes in Mercedes and BMWs and PCP contracts, they have no problem paying more rent. And the problem, of course, is to protect those who are vulnerable within the schemes. But as you well know, around about 45% get housing benefit or universal benefit in some form. So this business of just going to the wealth statistics is a huge problem. Those who sit on a council rent have the right to that for the rest of their lives, of the benefit when they can't afford, and they have the right to pass it on. And yet we treat them as having no asset at all. They have a very valuable economic asset.
Well, there's a number of points. Let me start with the first one about the literature on rent control. I don't agree with you. I like situations where you don't have to think about rent controls, when rental markets function effectively and incomes are growing steadily. And obviously, the benefit of price signals in generating investment is really important. If they themselves are problematic, and if the nature of a social security system will not redistribute income to households that they might have an adequate standard of living within that rental sector, you've got to think about what else do you do. We do have to think about that, because you're perhaps right in saying that rent levels are too low in terms of the kind of aspiration of housing standards. I might not disagree with you about that, but I would point out that the housing benefit that there is for people who are unemployed and the incomes that are there for people who are in the system may not be able to, in a sense, deal with that increase at the moment. I disagree with you about the IEA. The IEA are selective in their literature. I first published 7 or 8 articles about rent controls and their consequences in the Economic Journal and various other serious economic publications starting in 1974. I'll send you them all, and I'll quite happily send you another couple of hundred of American studies, including some from the World Bank, hardly left-wing organisations that say rent controls have a function in particular circumstances. I was objecting to the assertion that they never work anywhere. They do work in some places for particular policy objectives when you carefully construct a system. My point was, our system is not carefully constructed, and you are right that, and John Boyle from Retty's, a former student of mine, has been pointing out consistently about the loss in build-to-rent investment, which I think has been a great loss, particularly for Glasgow, but also Edinburgh. And I do think there are absurdities in the general area. And I don't talk about this because I don't live in Edinburgh all the time, and when I don't live here, I let my flat out. So obviously I have a vested interest, so I'll just be clear about that. But I do think that if we declare housing emergencies and have issues about short-term lets, but decide it's okay to have 3 mega concerts in the middle of the festival, that's crass stupidity amongst the councillors of the city. I would suggest that is making a serious problem worse. Anyway, I disagree with you on your point about the literature. I think that you've got a valid point that people have to discuss about rent levels and standards.
Gordon McRae from Shelter Scotland. We've very much been at the forefront of trying to encourage people to look at this as a housing emergency, and part of the reason for that, and I hope this isn't confirmation bias on my part, is to try and have this as a conversation about a system. And the last couple of years, we've stopped campaigning for new laws. We're not campaigning for rent control. We're not campaigning for new rights, although we would have supported a kind of rewiring of the rights system with a human rights bill. I think, however, what we found, and our housing emergency campaign was really inspired by Professor Marmot and the kind of the work that was done in the Marmot cities, and trying to say there needs to be an action plan. It's about the actions. And I think our campaign has worked in terms of declarations. There's people in this room who have had to do that. Where it's not quite caught the same traction is in the action planning, and the action planning being about not just the local authorities and their immediate areas of responsibilities, but that bigger systems approach. How does the UK government come into play? How do Scottish ministers understand not just their convening power, but their actual power when it comes to things? What I wanted to ask was, how do we deal with what still feels like third rails, local government sort of relationship with Scottish government? I think a housing sector that is quite atomised in some ways and still struggles to see beyond their own immediate sphere of concern, but also quite an I say this as someone in the housing sector, a relatively insular sector where we're not necessarily reaching out to bring those other stakeholders in. Quite a lot of the innovative thinking happens when there's a new problem. Fiona talked about the green ports. That challenge has emerged, and now we need to work out how we get the houses for economic development. So I think really looking at the kind of structures you're outlining there, I think there is an appetite for it. I think there's a challenge to the other people in the panel, but how can we get the housing sector comfortable to give up some of the vested interests that they've got with a view to a larger, longer term win?
Fantastic. I've got 2 more signal to complete the questions, and then we'll have to cut it off.
A very quick question, perhaps each of the panel. You have referred to it not being a short-term problem, but a long-term problem. How would you then ensure that government invests appropriately in the relevant vocational skills to meet the skills need?
I wanted to make 3 points, if I may, responding to a very interesting presentation from Duncan. I agree strongly with the point about income distribution and how that has become more unequal, and that's underlying a lot of the problems, and distribution of wealth perhaps even more so. But I want to say that I think the problem is even worse than we think it is, because there's something wrong with our statistics. Basically, the way we measure these things through surveys is increasingly inadequate and is missing more and more people at the bottom of the system. I mean, to illustrate that, you know, in 2022, our destitution in the UK survey that we do with Rowntree showed that the numbers at destitute in the UK had more than doubled since 2017. If you look at the official poverty statistics, they were flatlining. What's going on? COVID damaged a lot of our statistical systems and haven't fully recovered from that. Second point is, I think, you know, about the ability to model the system, and I feel, you know, governments ought to be able to do more in terms of modelling what policies would make how much difference to outcomes. I produce projections every year for crisis, every other year for Scotland, and I can tell you how much from that work, and it's a reputable bit of economic modelling, you know, how much we could reduce core homelessness by half in Scotland by, you know, 9 or 10 measures, and I can tell you how much, you know, but the government doesn't have anything like that. In fact, they occasionally come along to me and ask, you know, but I think the lack of, you know, that kind of system level modelling is a problem. Lastly, I wouldn't be quite so pessimistic about what could be achieved by the new government down south in terms of housing supply. I think it's still a lot to play for, but a key factor within that is to maximise the use of the planning system and planning obligation system in terms of driving down land values, driving out. We should not be throwing subsidy at land values. And I think in Scotland, there's always been a reluctance to really use that system effectively, much even less than it was used in England, particularly before the financial crisis. And you know, I've shown from modelling for England that they could get at least more than halfway to their massive social housing target that people are arguing for without actually increasing the exchequer subsidy through effective use of planning obligations. I think that, okay, the scope in Scotland isn't quite so dramatic, but there is more scope in Scotland.
Thank you. And I've got one of my trustees who I missed out at a previous event has just signalled that he'd missed me again.
Thank you, Susan. So I know you did say, you know, there's not a lot of good examples internationally we could emulate, but you know, Singapore and Norway are sort of considered sort of best in class, and they're similar size to Scotland in terms of population, very different in terms of landmass. And I wondered what's working in those countries that couldn't work here.
Fantastic. Yep.
I'll do it in reverse order. I may well forget what your question was, Gordon, because I'm old. Sam, I think that the Singapore model of the way in which you really capture the social purpose of land values because of the model they use is a very effective one, and we should think about it, or elements of it. Norway, actually, I think and I did 5 years work in Norway between 2012 and 2017 for Husbanken, which is the housing part of the National Oil Fund. Big difference, money. They have stacks of money. They actually have a housing system that is remarkably like the UK, rather than Sweden or indeed Norway. So I don't think their practice is fantastic, but their practice in saving their oil funds was excellent. So I think Singapore, really interesting, a lot of lessons. Norway, the lesson is if you've got money and spend it in good infrastructure, it makes a difference. Some of that I think is helpful. Glenna, on your point, I think, and I do think it's ridiculous, I haven't had a research project when I was in university financed within Scotland from the point I stopped being a special advisor to Donald Dewar. That's a long time. Whether or not I was an international expert, I just didn't get any interest from the government in Scotland in doing any work, Labour or indeed SNP. That was okay because there was a very substantial amount of housing economics research goes on in Australia, and I have a part-time chair in University of New South Wales, and also in Canada, where I have a part-time chair in McMaster University. So I could do things I was interested in, and also I'd worked in these systems. But I do think there is not a significant use of Scottish expertise that exists. Actually, and this isn't, it's not me, I'm not in this system anymore, and it's not just Glasgow, but Heriot Watt, Stirling, St Andrews all have significant people in a global sense. You could line up a dozen Scottish academics who are regarded as internationally excellent. They are never used or rarely used in these debates and discussions in Scotland. And that's partly, when I started my career, if you spoke at a conference, the minister, of course, would always speak first and quite often have to go away, but at least 3 or 4 civil servants would stop and they would listen to what speakers would say. Now, as soon as the minister lifts his file, everyone leaves. They're not interested in listening. And I'm sorry, because there's many good people in the civil service, but they're hard pressed for time. So that connection, Glenn, I think you do a great job in informing the housing policy debate in England, sitting in your office in Edinburgh. That's all I'd say. I agree with you about the statistics, but you would know much more about that than me. In terms of modelling the system, I think that economic modelling of the housing market and the housing system, including the national level supply estimates, are largely based on models that almost deny the nature of the system that they're modelling. In other words, if you assume that most econometric models, sorry to get nerdy here, they assume that the supply side of the system doesn't have any market failures, that resources are allocated efficiently by markets, and there aren't any significant lags in the system. So what was the problem then? You know, that the problem is the construction, the nature of, the fundamental nature of housing is that it has all these characteristics. So the modelling that we do basically misses the point. The baby gets thrown out with the bathwater of assumptions. So I think you have to understand housing systems, and that was my point about regional housing supply council and auditing systems. Build the models from below. Get the big chunky housing systems within a nation and build the models upwards, rather than getting these fairy stories and projecting them downwards. If this discussion was being held in an American university, I'd be taken out and shot at this point in time. I would have died in a noble cause, I have to say, because it's just a waste of time. And I think that in terms of pessimism about housing supply, I think the permissions thing in England will make a difference, as it would here. And some of the points that Callum was talking about, we have to take into account. But what I was saying, it wasn't enough. There's much more that needs to be done, and I know you know that too. And I just want to say that I have a note of caution about Rachel Reeves' forecasts because of not doing these other things. In terms of the skills, I think the understaffing of planning has been, I'm sorry if there's any planners here, this is not personal, but I think planning is a weird profession. And I don't say that in the Kamala Harris use of the word weird, and she would be correct in her use of it. What I mean is that it's never been comfortable about talking about economics. I've taught classes in economics to people who are doing planning, and actually getting them to recognise it's important, you can do that. But then when you go out, neither in driving the decisions about what land use plans you'll make do they model the economy very effectively, but they very rarely evaluate the economic consequences of the plans that get put in place. So the economics gets missed out. It then gets seen as the economy, And I do think that I actually sign up for a lot of the commitments about just transition and achieving net zero by the middle of the 2040s or whatever. But I think that that's all the planning profession have talked about in Scotland for the last 10 years. And that if you look at the national planning framework, it doesn't help. There's nothing about the economy in it. There's nothing about connectivity. The only connectivity in the first draft was arrows that went into the middle of the North Sea. That was a connection to the connection to Europe. And a couple of arrows that seemed to disappear into the southern uplands, and that was the connection to the rest of the UK. And that was about it. So I feel really critical, and the government have not helped by making strategic planning, and housing, this is really important, good strategic planning, that markets work well when the state helps remove the uncertainties. And one of the key spatial uncertainties is which place is going to grow. And that depends on where other people are going to go, and it depends where investment is going to go. Now, Mariana Mazzucato is, and Missions has developed that, actually is in the literature about government investment from the 1950s, and economics literature talks about this as a big problem, and planning can help. So planning has to give you a platform on which the market needs to perform. It doesn't do that. So sorry.
It also meant the skills across the whole sector.
Well, I would
because
say
you can't refurbish or construct without a range of skills, vocational skills.
Well, I would take the point.
We've gone over time, and David Hume Institute pride ourselves on bringing things in on time. So I'll say a few last words, but Fiona's desperate to get away from another meeting as well.
Yes, really sorry.
I really want to bring in Callum on skills and innovation, but we'll have to do that over a cup of tea. So if I can ask anyone with burning questions that we've not got to, that we can do it over a cup of coffee. Please do stay around. We've got the room for a little bit longer. Thank you for your time today. As Duncan said, this is the start of a conversation, but we don't want this to just be words. This is about actions and outcomes and disrupting the system, because at the moment it feels like we haven't got anything that's really moving forward at the scale or pace that we need it to do. And as an independent organisation working with someone with Duncan's level of depth of expertise, I hope that we can open this up and try and work out how we move forward. So please don't be strangers. Everyone online, please get in touch if you've not been able to already. Please share your thoughts. And as Kim did in her question, say how you'd like to be involved, because I think that's all really important. Yeah, it is a fast time scale, but there isn't time to be slow. And I think that's something that I can see many nods from the audience. This is about, we need to move this forward, and we need to move this forward now. So please come with us on this journey. Thank you.